In 1978, in Aberdeen, Scotland, a 9-year-old girl named Sarah Miller vanished while playing alone in her front yard. No screams, no footprints, just silence. Her family searched the entire town, but found nothing. Not a ribbon, not a shoe. Just emptiness. 45 years later, on a gray October afternoon, her mother, Fiona, unlocked an old music box that had been sealed shut for decades. Inside, hidden beneath the velvet lining, was a small piece of paper, its edges yellowed, the handwriting uneven and childlike. If you find this, follow the tree path. That box had sat quietly on a dusty shelf, untouched for almost half a century. But now it whispered again. That message, like a silent goodbye, breathed life back into a hope long buried. Could the mystery, buried for 45 years, have started not with Sarah's disappearance, but with this very box? Keep watching. The truth waiting at the end might just leave you speechless. Fiona Miller was 73 years old. She lived alone in the same stone house that once echoed with laughter. The house stood quietly at the edge of a park in Aberdeen, where the trees had long outlived the children who once played beneath them. Her husband, Thomas, passed away in 1995. A heart attack, they said. But Fiona always believed it was sorrow that took him. He had spent too many years chasing shadows, knocking on doors, calling Sarah's name down empty roads. Sarah was their only child. She disappeared at age 9. Since that day, the house had been frozen in time. Her room remained untouched. Dust settled over dolls. Faded books lined the shelf. A pink sweater still draped across the foot of her bed. The curtains hadn't been drawn in years. Fiona couldn't bear to move them. Each morning, Fiona would sit by the living room window, a cup of tea cooling in her hand. She rarely drank it. Instead, she'd stare out at the park, eyes soft, searching, as if waiting for a shape to emerge from the fog. The tea always went cold before she noticed. She had grown used to silence. No phones ringing, no visitors, only the distant sound of leaves falling, the creak of floorboards, and now and then, the low call of a mourning dove. The neighbors called her the Autumn Mother. They'd see her beneath the tall elm tree behind the house, gently picking up fallen leaves, one by one. She never said much, but sometimes she would whisper something to herself, then press a leaf into her coat pocket like a keepsake. Fiona had never moved, never left Aberdeen. When her sister urged her to relocate, "You need peace, Fiona," she had simply replied. "What if Sarah comes home and doesn't find me?" There's an old saying, when you stop waiting, they stop coming. Fiona never stopped waiting. Not really. Some nights, she dreamed of a girl standing at the gate, her face turned away, her voice just out of reach. And in those dreams, it always felt like Sarah wasn't far, just quiet, just waiting. It had rained all morning, heavy rain, the kind that echoed on the roof like slow footsteps. Fiona stood in the attic, wiping dust from old boxes, the scent of wood and time hanging in the air. She hadn't been up here in years. The light bulb flickered. Outside, the world was gray. She reached for a stack of photo albums when something small and familiar caught her eye. A wooden music box, square and worn, sat tucked beneath a folded quilt. The lock was rusted, the wood chipped at the corners. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it. The box had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. It was a birthday gift, given to Sarah when she turned 9, just days before she disappeared. Fiona had kept it all this time, but never opened it. Not since that week. The lock gave way with a soft snap. When the lid opened, a familiar tune began to play. Greensleeves. The notes dragged, warped by time, like a lullaby played underwater. Fiona froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The melody filled the attic, slow and haunting, curling through the silence. She stared at the velvet lining inside. Something didn't look right. She reached in and gently pressed on the bottom layer. It shifted. A false panel. Beneath it, folded tight and yellowed with age, was a slip of paper. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting stopped her heart. It was uneven, slanted to the right, the way Sarah used to write in 2nd grade. There were only a few words. "If you find this, follow the tree path." Fiona sat down on the attic floor. The box rested in her lap. Rain tapped steadily on the glass overhead. Her fingers brushed the paper again, her eyes wide, her chest tight, with something between hope and dread. She remembered the path. Behind the park, past the garden fence, there had once been a line of trees, narrow, twisted, like they'd been planted by children. Fiona and Sarah used to walk there in the evenings. Sarah called it the secret forest. The memory came back in fragments. Sarah skipping ahead, laughing. Fiona calling her back. A red ribbon in her daughter's hair. The sound of their footsteps on wet leaves. Then silence. Now, decades later, that path flickered again in her mind, like an old film reel. She didn't know what the message meant, but every part of her, every mother's instinct, told her it wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a voice reaching back across time, a whisper left behind in the only place that still held her scent, her song, her story. Somewhere deep inside, Fiona felt it. Sarah was near. Maybe not in body, but something of her lingered, waiting. Fiona told her sister first. They sat in the kitchen, the rain still falling outside, the music box on the table between them. Fiona unfolded the note, her voice shaking as she explained how she found it, what it said. Her sister listened quietly, then reached for her hand. "Fiona," she said gently, "sometimes the mind fills in the blanks, especially when it wants to believe." Fiona pulled her hand away. She wasn't angry, just tired, the kind of tired that lives in the bones. "I didn't make this up," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the folded paper. A day later, she told her neighbor, Mrs. Daly, the woman who used to babysit Sarah. The old woman leaned on her cane, looked at the box, and nodded slowly. "Maybe it's just an old game. Some child left it behind years ago. Nothing more." Fiona didn't argue. She smiled politely, then closed the door. But her hands were cold. At Sunday service, she spoke briefly with Father Brennan, a retired priest who had known the Miller family for decades. He listened, then said in a quiet voice, "Some griefs were meant to sleep, Fiona. God doesn't always answer the questions we carry. Sometimes he holds them for us instead." Fiona nodded, but something in her heart recoiled, because she remembered clearly that the music box had always been locked. Not once had she opened it, not since the week Sarah disappeared. She had sealed it, wrapped it, and placed it on the top shelf herself. She went home that night and opened her old journal. On the first page she had written, many years ago, "Something is still missing. Not just Sarah. Something else. Something unsaid." She placed the journal next to the box and stared at both. The paper inside the box had not aged like the rest. It wasn't brittle. It looked recent. That fact alone kept her awake. At midnight, the wind pushed hard against the windows. Fiona sat by the kitchen table, her eyes open, hands folded in her lap. From the hallway, a quiet creak echoed, like a floorboard stepped on, slow and deliberate. She didn't move. A moment later, the wind howled again, then faded. Stillness returned. But Fiona couldn't shake the feeling that someone had called her name. Not out loud, not with sound, but with memory, with presence. She placed her palm flat against her chest. It felt warm, not from fear, from something deeper, like a hand, small and familiar, had touched her heart from the inside. She told no one else. Not after that, but from that night on, she began to prepare, quietly, carefully, for something she didn't fully understand. A journey not marked on any map. One that began with a music box and a voice from long ago. The next morning, Fiona rose before the sun. The house was cold. The windows held a thin breath of condensation. She put on her old wool coat, the one with the torn pocket, and pulled her hat low over her ears. Outside, a thick fog lay over the park like a shroud. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with mist. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't even write a note. She simply walked out the door and closed it quietly behind her. Her shoes crunched softly on the gravel as she followed the old path, what Sarah used to call the tree path. It curved gently along the edge of the park, winding between tall poplars. Their white bark looked pale in the fog, like bones reaching toward the sky. The air was cold and still, and everything felt like it was holding its breath. Only the sound of dry leaves brushing against her boots and the distant sigh of wind moved through the silence. She walked slowly, but with purpose. Her eyes scanned the ground, the edges of the trees, the roots. And then she saw it, at the end of the path, half buried in earth and time. A wide oak tree, its roots twisting up from the ground like fingers. Beside it, a stone wall, covered in moss and ivy. She stood there for a moment, motionless. Then a memory came back. It was early summer, 1978. Sarah had been playing in the yard with a small shovel, dirt on her knees. She looked up and asked, "Mom, can I plant pumpkins behind that big rock near the trees?" Fiona had laughed, told her the soil was too shallow. But Sarah insisted. "They like secrets," she said. Now, standing here, Fiona knelt beside the tree. Her knees ached, her breath came shallow, but her hands were steady. She brushed away a clump of grass, then more. Beneath the soil, she felt it, a cold, flat surface. She kept digging with her fingers, the dirt wedging beneath her nails. It was a rusted metal hatch, round, old, almost fused to the ground. She traced its edges, then noticed a small handle, buried deep, barely visible. She wrapped her fingers around it. The metal was cold, gritty. Her hands trembled. She paused, looked around. The world was quiet. No one nearby. No footsteps. No voice to confirm what she felt in her chest. But her heart, her mother's heart, whispered something louder than doubt. It told her, "Open it. No one else will. No one else can." She closed her eyes, took a breath, and pulled. The hatch creaked open with effort. Rust cracked around the hinges, and the smell that rose was thick, earthy, metallic, and damp, like something forgotten for too long. Fiona leaned over the edge, shining her flashlight into the blackness below. There were stone steps, narrow, uneven, slick with moss. They led down into the dark, swallowed by shadow. She hesitated for only a moment, then began to descend. Each step echoed. The sound of her boots against stone bounced off the walls, sharp and lonely. Her heart beat louder than her footsteps. She gripped the flashlight tight, its beam trembling slightly in her hand. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person. The air was cold and damp. Water dripped somewhere, steady and slow. On the walls, her light caught something, scratches, carvings. She paused. One stood out. It was a child's scrawl. S and M, joined by a crooked heart between them. Fiona blinked hard. Her hand went to her mouth, then slowly reached out, touching the carved lines with her fingertips. That was how Sarah used to sign her name. On birthday cards, in her school books, even once on the kitchen wall. S. Hard M. Sarah Miller. A sound escaped Fiona's throat. Not a word, not a cry. Just breath and memory. Her fingers trembled. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone. It felt like touching the past. Like Sarah had once stood right here, small and afraid, and left this behind like a whisper in the dark. She kept moving. At the end of the tunnel, the walls opened into a small chamber. The ceiling was low, the bricks old and discolored. The air felt heavier here, still and close. She swept her flashlight across the room. At first, it looked empty. Then she saw it. In the corner, a blanket, purple, folded and half covered in dust. Fiona stepped closer. Her breath hitched. She recognized it instantly. The stars embroidered on the edges. The frayed corner Sarah used to chew when she was scared. It was the blanket that had gone missing the same day Sarah vanished. No one had seen it since. She knelt, her knees aching against the stone floor. She picked it up with both hands. The fabric was stiff with age, but it was real, tangible. Her eyes filled. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't move. Beside the blanket was a tin box, rusted shut. She forced it open. Inside, nestled in the bottom, was a small stuffed bear. Pale brown, worn thin. One eye missing. Its smile crooked. Its fur matted in places. She stared at it, frozen. That bear had been Sarah's favorite. She used to call it Captain. It had sat on her bed every night, until it disappeared with her. Fiona cradled it in her lap. Her shoulders shook. Her tears fell silently onto the toy's soft fur. She wasn't dreaming. This wasn't her mind playing tricks. Sarah had been here. Her scent, her touch, her world, all still breathing beneath the earth. Fiona sat on the cold stone floor, the purple blanket still in her hands, the stuffed bear cradled against her chest. The silence in the chamber wrapped around her like fog, but inside her, memories began to stir, not just fragments, but full, living moments. Something about being here, in this space, unlocked a door she had kept shut for decades. It was a quiet morning in June, 1978. Fiona stood at the sink, rinsing breakfast plates, sunlight streaming through the window. Sarah had just finished her cereal. She licked the spoon clean, smiled, and said, "I'm going out back for a little bit." Fiona nodded, distracted by the dishes. "Just stay where I can see you." But when she dried her hands a few minutes later and stepped outside, the yard was empty. Sarah was gone. The garden gate stood open, swinging gently in the breeze. No sound, no footprints, no giggle from behind the bushes. Just stillness. Fiona called her name, once, then again louder. Nothing. She searched the entire street, then the nearby park. She ran, barefoot, heart pounding, asking neighbors, yelling into the wind. By the time the sun began to set, her voice was raw. The fear had settled into her bones like cold water. That night, the police came. Flashlights scanned the woods. Dogs barked, picked up a scent, then lost it. For weeks, the investigation continued. Officers returned daily. Flyers were posted. Interviews were taken. But no real lead ever came. One woman, a jogger, said she had seen an older man with silver hair standing by the line of trees behind the park. He wasn't moving, she recalled, just staring toward the houses. But no one else saw him. No cameras caught him. His description was too vague. The sighting became just another line in a report. Months passed. The calls slowed. The visits stopped. The search faded. And in 1982, the case was quietly closed. Insufficient evidence, the file read. But for Fiona, the closing never came. Every time the phone rang, her chest tightened. Every time a child's voice echoed through the park, she turned to look. She began dreaming. Sarah would appear in shadows, calling, whispering, always from a place that felt far away, cold, narrow, and underground. Fiona would reach out, nearly touch her, and then wake up, the sheets soaked, her breath sharp. She once told a neighbor, "It's not that she's gone, it's that I don't know where." Now, in the still air of that underground room, with Sarah's blanket in her arms and Captain the Bear in her lap, those dreams didn't feel like dreams anymore. The dust, the carvings on the wall, the shape of that heart with two initials. They weren't fragments of memory. They were pieces of something real. Evidence, not imagination. The silence around her was thick, but inside her something stirred. Not fear, not pain. Recognition. She looked at the stone walls again, at the rust stains, the scratch marks, and for the first time in 45 years, she didn't feel alone in her grief. She felt accompanied, like the past had come back, not to haunt her, but to guide her. She stayed in the chamber longer than she had planned. Her legs had gone numb, but her hands moved slowly, gently, as if she were handling something sacred. Behind a pile of old bricks in the far corner, she found another tin box, smaller than the first. It was dented, rusted along the edges, but it opened without much effort. Inside was a notebook. Its cover was soft, the fabric worn down to threads. Fiona's breath caught when she saw the writing on the first page. Sarah Miller, May 1979. She froze. The ink was faded, but the name was clear. The handwriting was uneven, wide loops and shaky lines. A child's hand. She turned the page, afraid the pages might crumble. But they held. The first few entries were simple. Scattered thoughts. Bits of fear. A date then. I'm still here. I don't know the days. I miss my mom. One line stopped her. He told me I could have candy. The man with the silver hair. The park man. Her grip tightened. The air in the chamber felt thinner. She read on. Sarah had written about being taken underground. About the cold floor. About the music box. How the song reminded her of home. She wrote that she tried not to cry too loud, Because he gets quiet when I cry, one sentence read. But then something changed. A new voice entered the pages. A lady came. She cried when she saw me. She said she would help. Fiona blinked, reading it twice. A woman? Who? How? The next pages grew harder to follow. The handwriting became messy. Some words were crossed out. Others trailed off. Drawings filled the margins, strange ones. A sun with lines going backward. A door with trees behind it. An arrow pointing right, beside the words, "Go toward the light." It wasn't clear if Sarah had escaped or been taken somewhere else. But something had happened. Someone had tried to help her. Fiona stared at the drawings. Her hands trembled. These weren't just memories. They were directions. Fragments of a journey that had never been told. She turned to the last page. There, written in smaller, lighter script, almost invisible, was a single line. "I never stopped. I just waited for you to remember." Fiona dropped her head. Tears blurred the words. Her chest ached with something deep and wordless. All these years, she had feared forgetting. But now she realized it wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering enough. Following the right thread. Listening to the silence. Because somewhere between the dreams and the music and the dirt-covered stairs, Sarah had been reaching back. And Fiona, at last, had reached forward far enough to feel it. The chamber had gone quiet again. Fiona sat with the journal in her lap, slowly turning back through the pages, rereading the words with a kind of reverence. Her flashlight rested beside her on the stone floor, its beam dimming. The silence pressed close, heavy and deep. Then a sound. Soft, barely there, but unmistakable. Leaves crunching. It came from above. Fiona froze. Her fingers went still against the page. She turned off the flashlight without thinking, plunging the room into darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. The only sound now was the blood in her ears, pounding hard. She backed slowly toward the far corner. Her body pressed close to the wall. The notebook clutched tight in her hand. Her heart beat, so loud, she was sure someone could hear it. The hatch creaked. Light spilled faintly into the stairwell. A shadow moved across the opening. Then a figure, a man, descended slowly down the steps. He was tall, hunched slightly, his movements careful but unsteady. In one hand, he held a wooden cane. In the other, something metallic glinted briefly, maybe keys, or a pocket knife. His voice broke the silence. "Brought someone back down here, did you?" The voice was rough, aged. He muttered the words to himself like a memory. Fiona stayed still, pressed into the dark, barely daring to breathe. As he reached the bottom, the light from above cast his face into a blur, but it was enough. She recognized him. The silver hair, the gaunt face, the narrow eyes. He was older now, thinner, but the shape of his mouth, the way his chin jutted slightly forward. It was the same face from the photo police had once shown her. The face of a suspect. The man who had vanished without a trace. 45 years ago. There was no second exit. Fiona's palms began to sweat. Her grip tightened on the notebook. She inched sideways, staying behind a low pile of stone, heart racing, lungs refusing to exhale. The man wandered to the center of the room. His eyes scanned the space, but without urgency, as if he was looking for something that used to be there. He saw the stuffed bear on the floor. He stopped, sat down beside it. His cane rested across his knees. "Still here, huh?" he murmured. "They never come back." "Not really." He picked up the bear, turned it in his hands. His face was unreadable. 45 years, he whispered, then chuckled low in his throat. "No one remembers." Fiona's entire body tensed. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But she didn't move. Not yet. Not until he turned his back. When he did, slowly and without warning, she slipped from behind the stone pile. Her feet found the stairs. She climbed, fast but silent, barely touching each step. The hatch was heavier than she remembered. She shoved with both arms. It gave way, scraping loudly against the ground above. Cold air rushed in. Fiona pulled herself up and out, heart pounding, hands trembling. She didn't look back. She ran, breath shallow, chest tight, into the freezing night, the notebook still pressed to her chest. Fiona ran without looking back. Her chest burned. Her legs barely held her weight, but she kept moving, through the fog, across the empty street, until she reached the police station just after midnight. She pushed open the door, gasping for breath, her hands trembling as she clutched the small journal against her chest. At first, they didn't know what to make of her. An elderly woman, rain-soaked and pale, rambling about a secret tunnel, a missing girl, and a notebook that smelled of earth and time. But when they opened the journal and saw the handwriting, something shifted. One young officer, new to the district, leaned in. "This signature," he said softly, "matches a school letter we have on file. Sarah Miller, May 1978. Within the hour, a response team was mobilized. They followed Fiona back to the park. The hatch was still open, just as she had left it. Flashlights flickered down the narrow stone steps. The tunnel was cold and silent. He was still there, lying on the ground beside the bear, asleep or pretending to be. The officers surrounded him. He didn't resist. His eyes flicked open, unfazed. 45 years, he muttered. And someone finally comes back. His name was Dennis Hargrove, once a part-time city maintenance worker. His personnel records showed a pattern of short assignments, vague disciplinary notes, and a sudden resignation in late 1978. What the files didn't show was that he had continued living near the park, off-grid, in a small, unauthorized shack. For decades, he had gone unnoticed. During questioning, Dennis spoke in circles. He claimed he never heard her, that he took her in because she was meant to stay. He refused to say more. But inside the tunnel, investigators found what he didn't need to confess. Items that matched belongings from multiple missing child cases across the late 70s and early 80s. Some matched reports. Others were never tied to open cases, until now. They also found a set of vials, labeled in faded ink. One contained sleeping pills. Another, syrup of ipecac. Dennis had been sedating the children. Not violently, not quickly, but methodically over time. His motive wasn't lust or rage. It was control. A delusional belief that he was protecting certain children from the outside world, keeping them safe from noise and harm. But that wasn't the end of it. Among the items cataloged from the chamber, one officer noticed a small embroidered name tag tucked into the seam of the purple blanket. It wasn't visible at first glance, but when gently pulled loose, it read, Sarah E. Miller, 1977. That tag, intact and specific, was what triggered the next step. A detective, now rereading Sarah's journal entry about the woman who cried and said, "I'll help you," wondered aloud. If someone did help her escape, where did she go? The breakthrough came quietly, late into the night, as one of the detectives sorted through old hospital records, boxes that hadn't been digitized, only loosely labeled, many with faded ink. In a file dated August 1980, from a rural clinic 60 kilometers south of Aberdeen, he found it. Unidentified minor female, approximately 11 years old, brought in by unknown woman. Mute. Exhibits signs of long-term stress exposure. Repeats melody. Possibly dissociative. Attached to the intake form was a nurse's handwritten note. The girl hums the same tune over and over. Sounds like Greensleeves. No name. No family. No whatever came for her. The girl had been transferred to an orphanage, given the name Emily, after the nurse who stayed by her bedside. A year later, she was adopted by a quiet couple in Dorset who couldn't have children of their own. They gave her a warm home, a new last name, and a fresh start. Emily never spoke of the tunnel, never recalled a mother's face. But she kept one thing, her music box, the same tune, played every night before she fell asleep. When the police ran the DNA, the results came back conclusive. Emily was Sarah Miller. They told Fiona in person. She was sitting by the window when the doorbell rang. The officer held the file close to his chest, unsure how to begin. He said her name, gently, then said Sarah's. Fiona didn't move. Her hand reached for the armrest, steadying herself. Her lips trembled, but no sound came. She closed her eyes, not to block it out, but to hold it in. After 45 years, her daughter had a heartbeat again. The meeting was arranged with care. Not in a busy station, not in a sterile room. but in a quiet wing of a private recovery center where Sarah, now Emily, was being counseled through the return of lost memories. The room was soft, pale walls, a single chair placed across from another. The nurse who brought Fiona in whispered, "She's waiting." Fiona nodded, her knees unsteady. Her fingers clutched a folded photo from 1977. Sarah sat with her hands in her lap, her face older, gentler, but something in her posture was unmistakably familiar, tilted slightly, just like she used to sit during story time. She looked up, and in that first moment, neither of them spoke. Fiona's breath caught. Her hand rose to her mouth. The photo slipped to the floor. Sarah stood, slowly, almost in disbelief. Then, without a word, she lifted one hand and placed it gently on her mother's cheek. Fiona closed her eyes, leaned into the touch, and Sarah began to cry. Not the quiet kind, but the kind that comes from somewhere deep, the kind a child holds in for too long. She clung to her mother's arms and sobbed like a girl who had just been found in the woods. Fiona held her tight, rocked her, whispered her name. When Sarah finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "I was so close, Mom. I just waited for you to hear the song." 45 years is enough to fade almost anything. A name, a face, a memory held too long in silence. But sometimes, all it takes is a single note, a single piece of paper, to pull a thread that never truly broke. Fiona, now 74, no longer lives alone in the old stone house by the park. She moved in with her daughter, the girl once called Emily, now called by her real name again, Sarah. They drink tea together in the mornings. They walk slowly down the tree path in the afternoons. And every night before bed, Fiona winds up the old music box, and they listen together in the quiet. Their story spread through town like the first snowfall after a long drought. People whispered about it in shops, shared it in churches, passed it along like a small miracle. A mother who waited, a daughter who survived, a melody that never stopped playing. When asked what kept her from giving up, Fiona answered simply, "I didn't hear Sarah calling me, but I never stopped feeling like she was still singing somewhere." There's a small plaque now outside their front door. It's made of cedar wood, with weathered letters carved by hand. It reads, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." 1 Corinthians 13 verse 7. Sometimes, what's lost isn't truly gone. It's just waiting. Waiting for a hand to reach back, for a mother's voice to remember the sound of her child's silence, for a heart to listen to the spaces between the notes. So if you've ever lost someone, know this. They might not be far. They might be tucked away in the corners of old songs, folded inside a dream, or buried beneath a story that's not finished yet. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, please leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to Hidden Stories. We'll see you next time, where truth always finds a way home.